let's get going. So today, first, before we get started, anybody here new to Business Central? A couple people? How many people have used the planning worksheet and requisition worksheet and all that in Business Central? And a few people. Okay. And assembly orders, production orders, who's used those or know those? Just want to sort of judge where I have to aim the thing at. Okay, good. So what we're going to try and do today is, I'm telling you, this is going to be awesome. We're going to look at like 300 check boxes and figure out how they work. It'll be cool. So we're going to talk about the planning parameters and how they impact MRP. We'll try and keep it a little bit high level, but really if you have any questions about how this works. And the intent of this is really, like with the last session, for the people here, I should have mentioned, these presentations are sort of arranged around the questions that I get on a daily or weekly basis from partners coming in and saying, oh yeah, but can you do this, can you do that? And it all turns out to be sort of base nav or base Business Central configuration. So really what we're trying to cover off are the things that consultants and salespeople often ask us during a sales process, or implementation side. At any rate, that said, we're going to cover off how you do planning in MRP, and it's a weird session because we're going to keep it high level but also very detailed at exactly the same time. We're also going to talk about Stockkeeping Units 4 and really looking at MRP and how that works. But in order to look at MRP, we're going to go in and really look at the configuration to a large extent. So we're going to spend a lot of time on the configuration. We're going to spend like 1 minute on MRP, or maybe more than one. All right, so first of all, I just wanted to throw this in here, assembly versus production. How many use assembly orders, or how many people have customers that use assembly orders and know it? Lots. Production orders, we saw that already. Okay, good. Now, the reason I bring this up, I usually talk about this a little later, is there has been a recent change in, like the last release of Business Central, they actually changed something where that second one, you can actually use a planning worksheet now. Prior to that, planning assembly orders sucked because you couldn't, it was a weird gap. You could do assembly orders for light manufacturing, but you can use the planning worksheet, like the planning tools, to actually plan those assembly orders. They fixed that now. It's a licensing thing. It's still weird because we've got two things, requisition worksheet and planning worksheet, and anyway, we'll get into that. They do weird things. And does anybody know what the order planning page is in Nav or Business Central? That's another one. If you're using assembly orders, sometimes that might be a good fit. So it's not the planning button on the order, it's the order planning sheet in Nav. If somebody says order planning, sometimes people think there's the order planning thing on the sales order. There is a page called order planning that you can use to do order by order planning for assembly orders or production or whatever. Yes?
Sorry, hopefully this is not at the wrong time, but I didn't get order planning to work for assembly order in 2016.
Maybe. It's hard to keep track with, keep up with all the different versions and the idiosyncrasies of each version, but it should work. It should have worked from 2013 all the way up to Business Central. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, there is an order planning screen. It has issues in a lot of ways, but for assembly orders, if your customer is just using assembly orders, you might not care about anything we talk about today, and you can leave. I won't be sad. Well, I'll be sad, but I won't mock you as you leave, mock you after you get out the door. But you can use that order planning screen to plan those instead. If you don't do that, then you're stuck with the planning configuration. Planning configuration is lots of fun, unless you don't know it. So the first thing we talk about when we're doing the planning configuration is the manufacturing setup. So we have to start at a specific point where we're going to set some global settings to control how things work. And a couple of them up there, the components at location. So you set that to indicate, if you have multiple locations set up in your environment, that's where it's going to pull the components from. So if you're not using Stockkeeping Units, which we'll talk about later, you would set that, let's say my main location is east, and that's where I do my manufacturing. You'd go into manufacturing setup and set it there. You can also set up a default safety lead time, which applies everywhere in the system. So often we see things like, how come it's telling me to do the purchase order on the 20th when I put in the 21st? Well, because somebody put a default safety lead time of 1 day, and that affects everything, right? So, but it's useful. And why would you do a safety lead time anywhere? QA, it just gives you some time. Like anytime I do something, it gives me a 1-day buffer between when I actually need it and the due date that the system generates. So if I tell my vendor I need it on the 20th, you know, or I set the 20th on my purchase orders to when I actually need it, it'll tell the vendor deliver it by the 19th because I need that 1-day buffer. Come on in. It'll be fun. It'll be even more fun now that you're here. All right. And the last one is a combined MPS and MRP calculation, which we'll talk about in a bit. So that's the first stop, and you set up some numbering and everything else in the manufacturing setup there. But those are really the components allocation is really one of the key ones, and the combined MPS and MRP. There's a few other settings that you need to do there that don't relate to planning, but that you should look at, like including setup cost and production and those sorts of things, but I'll leave that for now. Anyway, now, replenishment parameters. This is how we tell the system to replenish our stock. That's why it's called replenishment, I guess. And there's 4. Anybody know what the 4 are for replenishment? How can I get something into my inventory? 4 ways. Yes, sir.
Purchase, transfer, production, assembly.
Yeah. First try. Awesome. And the transfer is a tricky one. Nobody ever gets that transfer. Like, there's only 3, but there is transfer as well. Okay, so those 4, transfer, production, purchase, assembly. What we're going to focus on primarily is purchase and production, but all the planning parameters apply to all of those. So that's the first thing you do is you set how you're going to replenish the product. And when you choose production and assembly, you can either do make to stock or make to stock or make to order, or assemble to stock, assemble to order. And that impacts how the production orders are generated. Okay? And on the assembly, it just gives you a little bit of shortcut on the sales order. I won't talk about that too much because it's not a planning thing. But for production orders, when you set it to make to order, it does some very specific things in how it generates the production order. I don't want to get into that in too much detail, but if you have questions about make to stock versus make to order, please ask. If you've ever seen a production order with a multi-level set of lines, like I've got my main product I'm building, then underneath indented I've got a subcomponent and so on and so forth, you get that by using the make to order stuff. Okay. And then the last one on here that's sort of on the replenishment tab is the scrap percentage. And scrap percentage, until 2013, was kind of a weird field. But now what that does, it says it applies to the finished goods. So if I've got an item and I said 10% scrap there, that means if I produce that item, the system is going to calculate an extra 10%. Like if I run planning, it's going to say, you need to build 100. I'm actually going to plan for 110 because I've added 10% scrap. And the second half of that sentence, it's the default option for the production BOM. So whatever scrap I put on there either applies to my finished goods production or it applies to my consumption of that item if it happens to be a component. And the reason I say it like that is all it does, that scrap percent on the item card gets dumped into the production BOM. The actual scrap management for components happens at the BOM level, not the item level. Okay? So if it's a finished good, the field on the item card controls the scrap. If it's a component, the field on the production BOM controls the scrap. Okay? Now, in the later versions of NAV, again, it defaults that scrap percent onto the BOM for you automatically. All right, so let's, to take a little break and we can look at fun software. We'll go in here and we'll actually look at some of these things. So first of all, and you know what, it's exactly the same. I can demo on the web client or here, but I'll do the Windows client for now if that's okay with everybody. So a couple of the things I mentioned there is the, where did it go? Combine MPS and MRP and the components at location. So these guys here are the 2 that I mentioned and the default safety lead time, right? This blank overflow level, we'll talk about that on the item card, that's a default. So some of these things, like the overflow level and the default dampener period and all that, those are the defaults that apply to the items, just like the safety lead time. Okay, so all these defaults here, you set up when you create an item, that's what gets pushed to the item, and we'll talk about what they do in a sec. Okay. All right, so let's actually look at an item, and this is where I may have to switch to the web client because there's some bad data in here that crashes the Business Central. Let's see if this actually works. Yeah, I think it's going to just crash Business Central here. Oh, look, it opened it up. Cool. All right. So if we go to the Replenishment tab, here are those 4 options. 4? Come on. Somebody's going to say, hey, Mark, you're an idiot. There's only 3. Okay, so why are there only 3 and not 4? Just out of curiosity. Because in the last thing, to reiterate, because I know we're all sleepy and tired, it was a rough night last night, wasn't it? It's on the Stockkeeping Unit. Yeah, this applies. This is your global item card. We'll talk about Stockkeeping Units, but if I want to transfer, I need something that indicates the location as well. Anyway, that's where you set the replenishment. And again, when you do that on production, you've got make to stock or make to order. Here, and if it's assembly, you've got assemble to stock and assemble to order. What does assemble to order do if I set that? Anybody know?
Creates an order directly when you create a schedule.
Exactly. All it does really is it just gives you a shortcut. It fills in the quantity to assemble to order on the sales line instead of you having to manually type it in. That's all it really does. But make to stock and make to order on the production side does a whole lot more. Like I said, I won't get into that. Okay, and there's the scrap percentage you set up, and that's basically it. And anybody know what lot size is for? No? All right. It's really for standard costing to figure out what your standard cost is based on a predetermined lot size. It doesn't really do anything for planning whatsoever. Anything significant anyway. Okay. Planning parameters. The fun starts here. So first of all, reordering policy. This is the most important thing. When you're doing automated planning, reordering policy determines how you're going to replenish that stock. Well, no, that's a bad way to put it. Replenishment determines whether you buy, make, or whatever. This determines how many or how you're going to do that planning. So what are the options for reordering policy? Yeah.
It's a fixed maximum, I think.
There's 5. All right. I got somebody. Yeah, the 5th one is blank. So blank means I don't plan it at all. So there's really 5. There's 5 options. Fixed reorder, which is the old like economic order quantity. When you buy something, you always buy a pallet. It doesn't matter how many you actually need. You buy a pallet because that's what you do. Not ideal. Wouldn't use it if I had a choice. Fixed reorder, then min-max. So that's the most common. Maximum quantity. It's not called min-max. It's called maximum quantity. And that's confusing because there's something else that's called minimum order quantity, and everybody thinks that that's your minimum quantity. So maximum quantity is the most common. Then there's lot for lot, which is demand driven. And I'll talk about that in a sec. And order. And that's order to order. There's always a match. One demand line, so in other words, a sales order, transfer order, anything like that, forecast line. One demand line results in one supply line. And that supply line, what's the supply, a document line for supply, that can be a purchase order, production order, transfer order, assembly order, right? Something that's going to supply the system with supply my demand, right? I've got demand out there, I need something to supply it, and order does it one-to-one. Now, I told you what min-max does, so I'm not going to ask you about that. Lot for lot, what does lot for lot do? Pretty much, yeah, it's demand driven. So min-max, like everything is typically, is basically demand driven, right? Min-max when I get at or below my reorder point. And that's, anybody here run like OldNav or have customers with OldNav? It's hard keeping up with all the changes they make, but they've actually did some good stuff recently. Like you actually now when you get to the reorder point on min-max, it'll actually reorder instead of getting below it. But, so technically everything is demand driven, right? Min-max, something is going to pull me below my minimum quantity, and it's going to tell me to reorder. But the thing is, it's going to tell me to reorder up to my maximum level. Lot for lot is demand-driven in that it'll only tell me to order if I have outstanding demand that I can't meet with existing inventory. I lied there. Somebody will catch me on it, but anyway. So if I have existing inventory, it'll supply it. Otherwise, it'll just tell me to create an order for exactly what the demand is. I lied again. You can catch me on that too. Now, the impact of that is maximum quantity tends to increase your inventory value. Lot for lot tends to pull it down, tends to decrease it. So if you're an organization that wants to run a little leaner, or your customers, I should say, are an organization that wants to run a little leaner, you would typically want to go with lot for lot. And the reason is exactly what I said. Maximum always tries to drive me up to my maximum quantity. So when I need to reorder, let's say my min is 10, my max is 50, I get to 10, it's telling me to order 40 more. Lot for lot is going to say, I want you to be at 0 all the time unless you have demand. And so it's always going to try and pull me down to 0, or the lowest quantity that I'm supposed to be stocking. Okay? So something to keep in mind. Well, we're getting to it. Yeah, we're getting to it. So there's lots of things I lied about there where I said, oh, it does this, it does that. It's not entirely true, because we can adjust all of those parameters, which is where we're talking about planning parameters, to address those requirements. Okay. Now the last one, order. Like I said, you often use this with make to order so that you can build up those multi-level production orders. But again, what it does is it links your supply and demand one-to-one. So if I've got a sales line, I've got a purchase order line that kind of matches that. Okay. I might have one purchase order that supplies 10 sales orders, but each purchase line is going to match that sales order line, okay, in that example. And then the fixed reorder, as I said, is the economic order quantity, where you've gone out. There's no tools within Business Central to figure out what your EOQ should be, but once you've sorted that out, once you've figured out what your economic order quantity is, this will do it, right? Like when I buy from this guy, if I buy, the best value is when I buy 500 of these, because they give me free freight and it's the right stocking level, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of tools to do that, but not enough for Business Central. This is another one. Like if you're dealing with inventory, this is actually worse than the min-max to drive your inventory higher. And nobody wants a ton of inventory that's going to sit there for months until you sell it. So I avoid that. Lot for lot is usually the best. And by the way, if you're starting out and you have no clue what your customer is going to do or how they need, or maybe you're doing an implementation, they have no min-maxes, but they want to automatically plan, turn on lot for everything. Because what does it do? If there's demand, it'll tell you to buy it. So you're not going to miss anything, right? Even if you don't have the right stocking levels, lot for lot will catch it. So turn that on. Instead of turning on min-max and going min of 1 and max 100 for everything and having the planner try and figure out what he actually needs, that sucks. All right, another field on that planning tab is order tracking. Order tracking sucks, don't use it. So turn it off. Safest is none. And I mean, it's gotten better over the years, so maybe Business Central, it's awesome and you can turn it on. But what it tends to do when you turn that on, there's a few options there. I didn't ask anybody what the options were, because just use none. But there's a few options there. And what it does is every time you do anything with that item from a supply-demand perspective, create a purchase order, create a sales order, whatever you do, it creates a reservation entry in the reservation entry table. So number one, it takes additional time to manage that, and it always screws up, always. Sooner or later, you're going to get an error that says, reservation entry can't be -1 on this, blah, 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 and you're screwed. Especially on Business Central, where you can't just go into SQL or back end and wipe it out. So turn that off. It screws things up. Now, if you don't believe me or if you don't want to, there are the other two, tracking and action messages. So tracking can be useful, because what it does is it ties your supply and demand together. So if I create a sales order for May 20th, and then I create a purchase order that's bringing in that product for May 19th or something like that, it'll dynamically tie those two guys together. And if I hit the order tracking button, it'll show me, hey, this sales order is being supplied by this purchase order, and it's all automatic. And you'd be like, that's cool, I like that, I want to do it. Don't, it screws it up. Use the item availability by event view, which sort of gives you that same in-out view that you can see what's supplying what, okay? And the last one is action messages. And that one can, again, all of these could be useful. If you're in a high volume distribution environment where they're checking, you've got 5 purchasers and every 10 minutes they're refreshing to see what they need to buy now, that could be useful. So anytime I add a new item on a sales order or whatever, it's going to allow me to quickly grab that and put it on a planning worksheet. I've rarely seen that used, but it can be useful. All right. Another one on there, there's reserve. So there's an option called reserve, and there's a few things you can do there. There's always, never, and optional. The default is optional, and you should just leave it at that for the most part. What that does is it allows you to control how items are linked together in supply and demand. If you set it to always, what will happen is it'll automatically create a reservation entry that links your supply and demand. It'll force you to do that, essentially. The difference between reservation and order tracking is reservation is what we call a hard peg. It's an explicit link between those two items that's more difficult to change. You have to explicitly go and cancel that reservation. Order tracking is exactly the same data, with the exception of one field. It's exactly the same data in the system, but it's more dynamic. You can break that, changing dates and things will automatically break it. Reservations, you have to explicitly break. So if you set it to optional, that allows you to either reserve or not as you see fit. Okay? All right. Independent parameters. So these are things that apply sort of globally. So you've got those essentially 5 choices that you can set when you're doing the planning: min, max, lot for lot, fixed reorder, blah, blah, blah. And some of these things apply to all of those different reordering policies. And I lie there a little bit because some of them don't, as it says on here. So this is how you control when you run the planning worksheet. It's kind of ugly. It's very noisy. It gives you a lot of messages telling you to do things. These are the first two allow you to control some of that behavior. So you can say, don't tell me to reschedule an order if it's within a certain time period. Or don't tell me to change the quantity on a purchase order if the demand hasn't changed within a certain range, right? So where that's useful is, I got a sales order out there and the customer wants it a little earlier, so shift it in. Now, NAV will never, Business Central NAV will never let you leave a PO that arrives later than your sales order. But let's say that PO, was supposed to come in a little later than what you wanted. You could set it up so that it doesn't tell you to reschedule that purchase order, right? So anyway, that wasn't a very good example, but I'll show you how that works in a bit. And the last one, the safety stock. So where you would actually use this, generally speaking, is lot for lot. What the safety stock does is it sets your new zero. Do you know what I mean by that? Who knows what that means? Exactly. So if I have an item and I set the safety stock to 10, what that does is the planning system, if I have 10 in stock, it pretends I have 0 in stock. That's my new 0, right? If I go below 10, the planning thing thinks I'm at -1. Like if I'm at 9, it treats that as if I was at -1 inventory. So that new 0 level, if I say 10, that's essentially the system saying if I have 10 in stock, it's like I have nothing in stock. Okay, so it's hidden stock from the planning system. So you can use it with min, max, and fixed reorder, but it's kind of pointless. It does do something different in the planning engine. One gives you a warning, one gives you an exception, but really it does nothing. So why wouldn't you want to use it with, say, a min, max? Like I've set a min quantity, I've set a reorder point of 10 and a safety stock of 10. What do you think is going to happen if I hit 15 in stock? Like 15, my reorder point is 10. What happens if I have 15 in stock?
Order for lot to lot?
Min, max. Yeah. So my reorder point is 10, safety stock is 10, and I got 15 in stock. What's going to happen? It's going to tell me to order. Yes, it's going to tell me to order because my reorder point is actually 20. It's the safety stock plus the reorder point. And I've got 15. I'm short, right? Because that first 10 doesn't count. That first 10 I have in stock doesn't count. Now sees that as me having 5 in stock. My reorder point is 10. I have to order, which is pointless. I would just set my reorder point to 20, and then I have one field to manage instead of 2. Okay?
Also, you get a lot more value out of inventory all the time.
Yep.
Safety lead time is better because, especially seasonal items, you don't sit them in inventory all year.
Yep.
Just order them a little bit sooner.
Exactly. Now, the way you would use it with lot for lot is I said lot for lot always wants to pull you down to 0. But nobody really wants to stock 0 and only order when a customer needs it. So you set up a safety stock on lot for lot. And then what happens, that's kind of your reorder point. It's kind of like your min-max. It's the min of your min-max. And so now what happens is a customer comes in, I have a safety stock of 10, and I've got 10 in stock. Nothing gets triggered because we have stock. Customer comes in and orders. I can fulfill that order, but immediately lot for lot says, holy crap, I got to order for this customer because it pushes us below our safety stock. So that is how you reduce your inventory value while still maintaining a reasonable level of stock to supply your customers. Right? And I mean, that's very basic stuff. There's lots of tools out there that'll do a better job, but that's a starting point. Lot for lot is better than min-max, is all I'm trying to say. I could have said that at the beginning and you could have left and we would begin. All right. So then we have some order modifiers that apply again sort of globally. So this is where you can set up how you want the thing to replenish. So let's say, whatever, min-max, lot for lot, and I always have to buy something in a dozen, or in a case or whatever. So I can set these things up so I can say, I always have to order in multiples of 12, or the minimum order quantity, I always have to order at least 100 for this particular item, those types of things. That's what it allows you to do. And one of the key things on that is the base unit of measure. So we see, does everybody know you can set up a purchase unit of measure? And a purchase unit of measure just means when I create a PO, it'll default to that, and I can create buy 5 boxes instead of 50 eaches. But this order multiple is always in the base unit of measure, not in the purchase unit of measure. So that's, people will figure out the first time they try and order something and go, what the hell is going on? That's why. Okay, let's go through and look at these things. I told you this was going to be fun, hey? Let's look at checkboxes and stuff. All right, so if we go in and, oh, shoot. Sorry. Technical issues here. We're still seeing it? Good. If we go in and look at the planning tab here, there's my option. So again, that's the first decision. How are we going to order this stuff in? And I've got fixed reorder quantity, which enables and disables a few things on here. And it's dynamic. So as I'm choosing the type of replenishment, so you'll notice on fixed reorder quantity, I set a reorder point that tells me when I need to reorder this product and the quantity I need to reorder each time. If I change that to lot for lot as an example, all that stuff gets disabled. I don't get to play with that. I now have these guys to play with. All right? So let's talk a little bit about the lot for lot stuff. One of the lies I told you is I said it always brings you down to 0. It'll try and fulfill the order based on what you have in stock. That's only if you turn this checkbox on. If you don't do that, the planning system doesn't look at what you have in stock at all. It's always just going to order new stuff. Even if I have 100 in stock, somebody wants 10, it's going to tell me to order 10. If that's turned on, it'll actually look at what I have in inventory. This lot accumulation period, there was a comment on that. What that does is it allows me to group demand within whatever time bucket, I shouldn't call it time bucket because time bucket's over there too, within that period of time. So if I say 1 week, what that's going to do is it's going to go out and look at all the demand within the next week and combine it and generate a single replenishment line for me for that set of orders. So if I've got 5 sales orders for 5 different customers that I need to supply within the next week, that'll grab that all, create one purchase line for me, or one production order for me to generate it. 1 day. Yeah. So if that's blank, it's just going to do a day by, it'll still group on a daily basis, but it basically becomes a 1-day bucket. Okay. Now, for anybody that's dealing with customers that have older nav, it's been fairly recent. I think it was actually 2016 maybe even that they changed it. That behavior was crap because what it would do is it would cut the PO for the end of the week. Well, what about the guys that wanted it on Monday? It's pointless. Now it actually cuts the PO on Monday, right? Okay, rescheduling period is another one where when we get into sort of talking a little bit about MRP, I got to speed up. You guys got to keep me on track here. This controls whether the system tells me to reschedule a purchase order or a production order or not. So for example, my demand changes. I got a sales order that's supposed to go out May 20th. The customer says, ship it out next week instead, May 27th. Guess what MRP is going to do? It's going to tell me to reschedule everything to meet the new due date. Why? We don't care, mostly. Especially if it's PO, I've already cut the PO. I'm not going to phone the vendor and go to all that hassle. So in this rescheduling period, I can set a period where the system won't tell me to mess around with stuff. Okay. The example I used earlier is where that won't come into play is if my demand comes sooner, right? Like the guy says, oh, I want to ship it on the 17th instead of the 20th. It doesn't matter what's in here. The MRP is going to tell me to make a change to bring that purchase order in sooner than what it's supposed to come in. It's not going to let that purchase order come in late and supply my customer late. Okay? All right. Any questions on that guy at all?
What was the difference in that and the dampener period? Wasn't the dampener sort of the same?
Yeah. So the dampener period is basically the same thing. It'll do if there's changes in quantities on the demand. Okay, so this is typically more date-based. Dampener is more for quantity. So if I change a quantity within a certain period, like let's say PO is supposed to arrive in 2 days, and the demand changed, within that 2-day period, it's not going to tell me to reschedule the PO. If the PO is supposed to arrive next week, and the quantity changes, then it'll tell me to change the quantity on the PO. Okay, so that's basically what the dampener does. And same thing with dampener quantity. It's a threshold as to when it tells me to change the quantity on the PO. Or product, and I use PO, but production order or whatever. Okay?
Base unit, you said, right?
Base, yeah. This is all base. And for those of you who didn't hear, base unit of measure is what I mean. Okay. Now the other common, again, the three most common are lot for lot, min, max, and order. But if order, it doesn't have a lot of options because it's always one-to-one relationship, right? I have a sales order, it's going to create a line that matches, and there's not a lot of things you can modify. But if I go to min-max, we can now set a reorder point. This is my minimum stocking quantity or reorder point. Not to be confused with this, because I see that a lot too. People, they don't think all of a sudden or whatever, and they see minimum order quantity and they think that's their reorder point, okay? Reorder point is actually when I'm going to order this. So if I set this to 10, it's going to come in, and as soon as I hit 10, it's going to tell me to reorder, and it'll take me up to my maximum quantity, which let's say is 87 for some reason. This reorder quantity here, well, you can't see my mouse. This reorder quantity is blanked out. I can't change it. It doesn't do anything. It still shows 100 there, but the planning system doesn't look at that. Okay. Overflow level. Anybody know what that might be for? I just need a break from talking. So. All right, so overflow level. Let's say I cut a PO. It's kind of like the dampener in a way. I cut a PO for 100 or whatever to bring me up to my maximum inventory, and then something changes. I do an inventory adjustment or I get a return in, and all of a sudden that order is going to push me over my maximum stocking level. That controls whether the system tells me to change that PO, that replenishment or not. Okay? So it says, yeah, my max is 87, but I could go up to 100 here if I needed to, and the system won't bug me about it. Does that make sense? And then time bucket here is kind of like the lot accumulation period. It'll look ahead to see what else I might need to buy. If I don't set that up, I could potentially have 3 or 4 different orders a week to bring me back up to my maximum quantity because a bunch of sales orders on different days are pulling me down to my reorder point. So that's basically, that time bucket is basically like the lot accumulation period. And I think they made it separate because they didn't want to rename this field, and if they just called this time bucket like a lot of systems do, then they could have just used the same field. It does basically the same thing.
Is there anything in here that would help you vendor minimums for like discount minimums?
No. There are add-ons for that, but not here. Unfortunately not. No, the best you can do is this guy here, minimum reorder quantity, or minimum order quantity. And all that is basically your minimum, but it doesn't help you plan or anything like that. And what it does there is, again, if I'm ordering this product, I can say I need to order at least 100 to get prepaid or whatever I need to do. Okay? So I could set that up. And these things can get a little bit weird, right? Like if I set a minimum order quantity of 100, that configuration doesn't really make sense. I mean, it'll work, but it doesn't make sense because my max is 87, and you know, if I get to 10, I have to order 100, which puts me over my max. It doesn't make sense necessarily. Unless my orders are always in blocks of, you know, 80 or something like that, then it might make sense. If you're ordering truckloads, yeah, I know, but just what I meant was I wouldn't have a max of 87 and a minimum order quantity of 100, right? Because I'm likely always going to go over my max when I place an order, but whatever, you get the general idea. Now the maximum order quantity, let's say I put 200 here, and I have demand out there for 500. What's going to happen? It's going to tell me to order 200 and tell the other customers to go pound sand or something? What do you think that'll do if I put multiple PO lines? Yeah, so, or production order lines. So what it'll do is it'll still order everything. It'll just create different lines on the PO for me to supply that. So, yeah, useful or not, I don't know. It'll still get a PO that tells me to order 500. I'll just have 3 lines on it, 2 for 200 and 1 for 100. So whether it's useful or not, I don't know, but it's there. And the last one, of course, is order multiple, where if I have to order in multiples of 12, then I would set that, and away we go. Now, the other thing I get questions about is, or comments or questions, this only applies to the planning worksheet, MRP. That does not enforce anything. If I manually enter a PO, it's not going to yell at me. It's not going to warn me anything. I can enter a manual PO for any quantity. None of this stuff applies. Okay? That's often a modification partners will do to warn people if they're not ordering the right minimum quantity, the right order multiple, if they manually do a PO. If you, exactly, if you have a purchase unit of measure that's a multiple of 12, then that would work, assuming they use the purchase unit of measure. They might change it to pieces and order 8 because that's all the customer wanted. No, once you have that unit of measure, it's available, unless you do a modification, right? So yeah, if you've got your base unit of measure is pieces and your purchase unit of measure is cases, if they manually do a PO, they could choose either one to order by, regardless of what you set for purchase unit of measure. All right, so that's, I told you it would be fun looking at all those check boxes, right? People are looking at their watches already. Oh, this is crazy.
Is there any place where you can see the history of the sales for the item or forecast for that item?
Yes to both, kind of. So sales is just the item ledger entries. So if you go into item ledger entries, you can see, which maybe it wasn't selected there. Oh, sorry, where's my mouse? If you go in there and you do the item ledger entries, that'll give you all your purchase, all your transactions, including sales. There is a field on here, by the way, called source code. Make that visible, and you can now see the customer number or the vendor number in this view, and then filter on it. It makes it much nicer, especially if you're on a sales order. You can add a little button. You don't even need to write any code for it. Add a little button that says history. You click on that, it'll load the screen, and for that customer and that item, it'll show you all the history, including pricing and costs and everything else. So from a partner perspective, that's a very simple little modification. Everybody loves it. Little history button, click on it, filters this by that customer and that item, and it's nice. But that's where you see it, in the item ledger entries. Now the forecast, there's a couple of things. In New Business Central, they have that little forecast, sales forecast window that uses machine learning, gives you a little chart and stuff like that. You can look at that. When you cut a PO, you can use that sales forecast to help generate the POs. So, by the way, all the stuff that we're talking about today, like that's gone in 5-10 years. Like none of this stuff will matter. It's all just going to be, you dump all this data into whatever machine learning thing like Cortana or whatever, and it's going to go, you need to buy 100 of these because you sold X amount last year, and you know, whoever, New York's in the playoffs, and you know, it's sunny and all that stuff, and it's going to look at 300 different variables and say you need to buy 5. And you're not going to care about any of this stuff. We're not even going to look at this stuff in 10 years, let's say. With no history, you'd have to do something, yeah. Yes, sir.
Without getting too off tangent, for a new business central partner that's really focused on distribution and didn't have manufacturing modules, they really only have a purchase and a sales budget, which does nothing except store data. Can you explain a little bit about what you get from manufacturing with a forecast without Cortana?
it works with sales as well. So that new Business Central little forecast dealie there, that nice information. It's pretty. It's not that useful yet, though as I said, I think it will get very useful. The other thing you can do for forecasts, there's something called production forecasts. Now, this is available in Essentials as well if you're just doing distribution. So it's called production forecast, but it is available in, they even call, oops. Oh, demand for, yes, they've changed it. That's why, because it's now available in Essentials. It used to be called production forecasts, which is only available in Premium. They call it demand forecast now because they want to make it available for everybody. But it works exactly the same. It works exactly the same. And what a demand forecast does, and we'll see this when we run MRP actually, is it lets you set up, this is not a, it lets you set up your sales forecast, which is kind of what historically people have used as a production forecast, or a component forecast, or both. And typically what most people use this for is a sales item. And this allows you to come in and say, for a specific location, usually that's the first thing people forget, is they forget to put a location in when they build their forecast and they totally screw it up. I can say, where is my mouse now? I can come in and say, I want to do a monthly forecast in here of 5 this month, and 10 this month, and 20 this month. MRP is going to pick that up and generate purchase orders or production orders based on that forecast. Right? It doesn't have to be production. This will do purchase orders or assembly orders or whatever else based on the replenishment system for that bike, or transfer orders as well if we're doing SKUs. Anybody know what the big challenge on that one is? Sorry, go ahead.
Question, because isn't that only available in certain type of planning, like the planning worksheet?
Yes.
If not the requisition?
Right. Planning worksheet only. But Planning Worksheet is now available for Essentials and Premium, so you can use this for distribution companies only. It doesn't have to be manufacturing. One big sucky thing about this is, though, I did a monthly forecast. June, I'm forecasting when to sell 20 of these things, right? Now, what we actually look at for this, normally you would want to do sort of first day of the month, or you do your forecast for July, but you put it in June. And the reason is, what it's doing is it's creating a demand line for me. And later on, I'll talk about, well, if I have time, independent and dependent demand. Independent demand is external demand, something external that's driving me to make or buy something. And dependent demand is internal components. Like I'm building something, and because I'm building this, I need a bunch of stuff. This is what we consider independent demand. So it's basically as if I had done a sales order for those 20. Now, what it does is it creates a line for demand. And, oh, they have changed that. Awesome. Anyway, creates a line for me with a date, the June 1st or whatever on there. And the problem with doing it monthly is what happens is I come in there, and let's say, I forecast 20 in June, and, May is already done, essentially. If I sell 20 immediately in June, it doesn't recognize that I've already made and sold 20. It doesn't look at what I've sold so far.
Does it net against it?
It doesn't net against it. Yeah, so the only way to do that, it does, but only if you fall within that time frame. Okay, so what you need to do when you do these forecasts is typically daily or weekly. Otherwise, what it's going to do is you're going to build or buy too much, right? So if I've already executed a transaction in June for 20, well, that was my forecast, it doesn't see that. It's going to build 20. Now, if I have 20 sales orders out there that I haven't fulfilled yet, it's going to net off. But if I've already executed that transaction, it doesn't see it. Okay? Make sense? So open sales orders will net against this, or open demand will net against that. But if I've already executed that transaction, it will not net against that number. Okay, but that's the forecast. Sorry, go ahead.
So is there, does it auto-populate with, can you auto-populate with what your past
Nope.
history has been?
No. There's add-ons for that do that, but this is strictly you go in and fill in what you think your forecast is, but something else has to generate these numbers. And then what you do is you have something else generate those numbers, and there's a table here, the forecast entry table, that you can actually just import these, or you can edit this in Excel or whatever you need to do. But when you edit it, you just have a bunch of lines, dates and quantities and items. So you have something else generated and imported.
You guys mentioned that there's a Cortana forecast. Was there a way to extract that?
Not right now, but you never know. They change things daily. So there may be a way to do that now, but that's what's coming down the road, right? Like eventually, I don't know when. But right now you can't. Okay. All right, but there are add-ons out there, anything from small little things that are very basic all the way up to massive solutions that will optimize your inventory and everything else. Any other questions on the forecast side? All right. I'm going to have to speed up here or we're going to be screwed. All right, so I won't talk about this other than just say, if you want more, this is actually a screenshot out of the Microsoft documentation. There's a very good white paper, if you go to the Microsoft Docs, docs.microsoft.com, that describes all those planning parameters in a lot more detail. Like looking at this, you're like, what the hell is that? But you go through and it'll give you more information about how those things interact. But really, if you're going in and you're setting this up from scratch, the simplest thing is lot for lot, possibly with a safety stock and a lot accumulation period. And that's going to cover like maybe 80% of your cases off the bat. And you don't have to worry about much else. All right. Now, stockkeeping units, speaking of distribution, you may end up with a situation where you have multiple locations. All those planning parameters and everything I talked about, you can set up per location, so per warehouse. So pretty much everything that we looked at, the stocking levels, accumulate, all that stuff, you can do per location. So different warehouses can have different stocking levels. Okay? And this also is where you set up the transfer replenishment method. So let's say you have a main distribution center and you have a bunch of stores. Those stores can have min-maxes, right? Maybe they are min-max driven. Your distribution center is lot for lot. And the way when you run MRP, the way the stores get replenished is through a transfer order. That transfer order creates demand in your warehouse builds or buys it, and then ships it out on a transfer. Okay, so that's what stockkeeping units are for. Any questions on that? I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. Okay. All right, so let's talk about MRP real quick in the last few minutes we have. So there's two worksheets in NAV. Of course, you see all the answers, but what's the difference between the two worksheets? Well, Mark, requisition worksheet is only used for purchase planning. You're right. That's an awesome answer. All right, so it's kind of a weird situation because the requisition worksheet has a couple of functions that you need to use that aren't on the planning worksheet. And it used to be there were things on the planning, anyway, it's a little weird. So the planning worksheet is usually what you want to use. The requisition worksheet is good for purchasing. Well, that's a relative term. You use the planning or the requisition worksheet for purchasing, typically. But everything you do on the planning or on the requisition worksheet, you can do in the planning worksheet with two exceptions. Anybody knows what you can't do in the planning worksheet that you can do in the requisition?
I know one thing is it won't pull job.
Right. The ones I was thinking of were special orders and drop shipments. Yeah, which is weird. I don't know why. But anyway, so you have to use the requisite. If you use the purchasing code on the sales order for drop ships and special orders, you have to execute those on the requisition worksheet unless you copy that button from the requisition worksheet and slap it on the planning worksheet. Now the planning worksheet can do it too. That's all you need to do. It's simple. Okay. And where that requisition worksheet is often used, though, is if you're in a manufacturing environment. Somebody will run MRP. They'll figure out everything we need to build this stuff. And then the planner will go, oh, I don't want to buy it. And he'll just move it over to the requisition worksheet. And now the purchaser has the stuff he needs to deal with. So the production planner is kind of the big dog, the master guy. He figures out what needs to happen. He just tells purchasing, do this. And then it goes to the requisition worksheet, and they manage it there.
So distribution companies usually use requisition worksheet, manufacturing.
Historically, that's kind of been what it is because you didn't have access to the planning worksheet in the starter pack or essentials licensing. In the essentials licensing, unless you did a modification, essentials licensing now includes the planning worksheet, so there's really, don't use the requisition worksheet. That thing sucks. And the main reason it sucks are well, pretty much that last one is the main reason it sucks. When you run that requisition worksheet, if there's an error halfway through it, it stops and says, hey, you got an error, and you got to go fix that error, and then you start running it again. It'll start where you left off. But it's a real pain in the butt. You stop, the plan stops every however often if you've got issues with your, like you've got a blocked item or whatever thing pops up and gives you a complaint. With the planning worksheet, you get an error log. So you run the whole thing and it says, hey, I couldn't plan 10 of these things. And you open up the error log and then you can go adjust them one at a time and fix it. Okay, that's one of the main reasons. And it's just a better tool generally. I mean, they're not the greatest tools anyway, but it's a better tool. All right, hey. Okay, now when we run the, who's actually seen the planning worksheet or had to run it or help the customer with it at all? A few people. It sucks, right? You get all these stupid messages. So what happens is the planning worksheet is very noisy, but what it'll do, oh, I'm on the wrong slide. What it'll do is when you run that plan, you have a few different options. One is a get action messages I mentioned, where if you've made a change to a sales order or purchase order and you get action messages, it'll bring that change in immediately. It doesn't replan anything, it's just getting new demand. And that's bad and good. It's bad because it doesn't really, check it doesn't look at the full supply demand profile. It's just looking at the new stuff that's popped in, but it's okay. The net change is a little faster than this regenerative. Net change will go through and look at your full supply demand, so it matches up all your demand out there, all your supply, figures out what the differences are and tells you what to do about it. It won't take into account anything in manufacturing. If I've changed capacities or I've blocked a work center or any of that kind of stuff, it won't take that into account and change dates or anything else. So if I've made any changes to some of the master data, net change won't do it. But that doesn't happen very often. So net change is not a bad choice to run it. Maybe you run net change, Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday you run a regen, and Thursday, Friday you run net change or something like that. And the reason you do that is regenerative looks at everything, but it runs a little slower. Now, little slower is subjective. Sometimes that's an hour faster. Sometimes it's 2 minutes faster, depending on the volume of data. So you'll notice if you go in there now, they've kind of hidden those other options, and really they just say, just run regenerative every single time, and it's fine, right? Yes?
I don't know if it's improved in the newer versions, but it locks people out.
It can. Part of the reason it locks, when you run regenerative plan, while you're running the planning, it can lock records. The main one it locks is reservation entries. And that's if you have order tracking. Turn that crap off and it'll be better, right? So that's one of the ways you can prevent some of that locking, is because it's locking that reservation entry table to do that order tracking. If you don't have that on, you get less of that. And it's still going to do some of it, but you're going to get a lot less locking if you do that. Okay? And so a lot of people run it overnight or whatever. All right. I talked about that already. So let's actually look at the planning worksheet. I actually asked you already who's seen the planning worksheet and all that stuff. But we'll go in and have a quick look. All right, so it's not all that interesting to look at. Oh, well, it's really not interesting to look at. Okay, now it's slightly more interesting, but still not that good. So this is it. I mean, this is what you get. And when you run the plan, so as I mentioned, they've kind of got rid of the other ones. They've got to get action messages, but that's probably the most useless out of all of them. But they still have that up there. But if you want to run the net change, you actually have to come to the actions. But when you run a regenerative plan, what you're doing, again, is you're going out and it's looking at every single item in the system or whatever you filtered it to. So it's going to look at every single item. So if you have 150,000 SKUs, it's going to go through all of them. That's why it takes so long to run this thing. Okay, and there's add-ons that speed that up. But it's going to go through and look at everything based on the date range you specify and generate your plan. Now, the first one up there, anybody know what MPS is? Hi. Right. It's in Business Central and Nav. It's useless. It's kind of a pointless thing. In that there's really within that manufacturing setup, there is an option there to run MPS and MRP together, and that's usually what you should turn on. And the reason is MPS, it's a master production schedule. It'll go out, it'll look at all your independent demand, so all the stuff that's external, and it'll give you a list of all the things you need to buy or build. And then when you've done that, the idea is you would first plan that out, set the dates, all that kind of stuff that you want to do, and then you'd run MRP to plan your component demand. Well, because of the MPS, it really doesn't do much. It just brings in the due dates from the sales order. It doesn't really give you a good tool to plan. It's pointless to run it independently. So if you run them both, it's just going to plan your independent demand and your components at the same time. So it's usually quicker, easier, just do that. Okay? And there is a setting, like you can see here, I can't run them both. There's a setting you turn on. Now the starting date is the date that I'm going to start planning from. Now what happens, I said today is the starting date. What happens if I have a sales order from yesterday that I haven't fulfilled yet? Does it ignore it? Any idea? No. I beat you to it. It doesn't ignore it. That starting date is not the date I want to start planning from. It's basically the order date that's going to show up on my POs or whatever else, right? If I have demand, or if and this is why I don't use min-max. It's very hard to trace back min-max events. If I have a reorder point, if I have something that went below the reorder point a month ago, or if I've got sales demand from a month ago, it's still going to pick it up on here. It's not going to let me leave stuff, you know, unsynced, basically, or unbalanced. Okay, so that really, what that, in effect, all that starting date does is that sets your purchase order date. That's really what it's doing, right? So if I'm low on my min-max, it's going to set my purchase order date as that date. That's what it's doing. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Yes, you could potentially do that. In the limit totals, now the problem is you can only limit totals to things that are on the item card. So there's some stuff you can do, because there's lots of fields for supply demand on the item card that aren't shown by default, like quantity on purchase order, quantity on sales order, all that stuff. But as soon as you start doing that, you have to worry about the date phasing, because anyway, it's potentially possible, but it's probably not realistic to do that, right? You could definitely limit inventory with that date filter fairly easily, but if you're starting to look at some of the other supply demand fields, it'd be very difficult to do. Now the end date is actually the end date that we're going to plan out to. Okay, so if I have demand that goes outside of that end date, it's not going to consider it. And there is a problem with that. What happens if I have a sales order for June 2nd, but it takes me 4 weeks to get that in? Well, now I've got a problem, because I should order it today, but it's not going to pick it up because it doesn't see that demand. So it's not going to consider that vendor lead time in that date filter. Okay, so that's a challenge you have to be aware of. So long lead items, setting an end date is going to have an impact on those. So what often people will do is they'll just plan out to the end of the year or a year out in advance. They won't actually put an end date there at all. Okay. Here's where you specify the forecast you want to use. So that demand forecast we looked at earlier, that's where it will basically treat it as additional sales demand as we go through it. And this exclude forecast will prevent you from bringing in the forecast from last month that wasn't called off by sales orders and all that sort of thing. And the last one here is probably the most important out of all of these guys. Lots of arguments with Microsoft over this in older versions of Nav. You want that turned on all the time. And the reason is, without that, if you get what an exception message is if something is, if you have to order something in the past to fulfill a due date, that's an exception, that's a problem. And without that turned on, it won't look at any of those planning parameters we talked about, or any of the order modifiers more specifically. So if my minimum order quantity is 100, but I get an exception message that says I need 5 right away, it's going to tell me to order 5. Well, I can't do that. My vendor won't sell me 5. My vendor wants to sell me 100. With that turned on, it'll respect that. So you always want that on. It should just be on all the time. Anyway, and then when I run it, I don't know if there's any data in this thing. It'll go through, execute it, and give me a bunch of messages, and they're kicking us out. Damn it. If you want to talk about more of these messages and how we deal with this mess, if any of you have talked to your customers, this new cancel deal here, that is the bane of everybody's existence. And that's there because we don't have those dampeners and things like that turned on to eliminate those reschedules and everything else. So it's telling me, hey, I couldn't figure out why you created a PO for that bike, cancel it, but up at the top, create a new one for a different date, right? So this is all date oriented. If I had, I mean, that's a pretty big range of dates, but if I had some of those rescheduling periods and things set up, I wouldn't see those new cancel messages. I wouldn't see that noise. All right, well, we ran a little long, but thanks everybody. Appreciate it. If you have any other questions, I'll be around. You can come and ask. Thanks.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel.